Thank you for inviting me to speak with you this morning. Thanks to the ISSRM and its conference organizers and the members of the public not part of this extraordinary organization that have come today to hear this talk. For reasons likely to become obvious, I need to declare to you that the views expressed are my own and do not reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the United States government. Nicolas Guillen was a communist Cuban poet. Now you can see why I made that declaration. He was born in 1909 and died in 1989. His poetry, powerful and political, blended European, African, North American, and Amerindian cultures as they were expressed in Cuba. In 1937, already internationally renowned, he penned a major work about the Spanish Civil War, Poema en Cuatro, Angustias y una Esperanza, a poem of 4 anguishes and 1 hope. It sets the theme of what I'd like to share with you, for he unites the struggle between North and South, the link between North and South, the struggle between hope and anguish, and the linkages between them. He writes, "Against scepter and crown and cloak and saber, people with my voice, so that the heart speaks to you. I, your friend, my friend, your friend. With you yesterday the hands of the conquistadors, and today the impetus for demolishing frontiers, and for seizing remote and gleaming stars, and tearing apart trembling and distant skies, to carry aloft what is made golden by the sun of every dawn, to carry aloft what is nourished by the sun of every midday, to carry aloft from the equator to the poles, to carry aloft a tongue that is never silent, that will never be silent, a sea of tears, salty, curving, crashing against all the parks. I, your friend, my friend." So, I would like to talk to you today about the ecology of hope and devastation in 5 brief chapters. First is ambivalence. Our relationship with nature can be described as ambivalent. Sometimes we attempt to dominate it, and other times we attempt to run from it. This is a dust storm in Stratford, Texas in 1935. Sometimes our over-exuberance is expressed. This is the Burj Al Arab Hotel, over 1,000 feet high on the Dubai coast. And sometimes our relationship is tempered by powerlessness. This is Banda Aceh, 25 December 2004, just before the tsunami. And this is Banda Aceh after. And the fragility of our grip on the landscape is real and relevant to the conference that you are having here. This is the Nile Delta in February 2001. Now, one route to understanding, one of many routes to understanding, is to try to understand and document as best we can the structure and dynamics of human ecosystems. And for some of us, a brief flash of a review may be in order on the roots of human ecosystems. This is Sir Arthur Tansley. He invented the term ecosystem in 1935. By the way, the biologist Tansley went on to study psychiatry with Freud. And this is the first time the word ecosystem was used in a scientific work in a Festschrift written by Tansley on vegetational concepts. The early ecologists looked at streams and rivers and lakes, and they named the parts. This is Shefford's first ecosystem model, and he's attempting to name the parts: squirrels, wolf, skunk, nuts, fruit, bark, and no people. And no people. They used lakes as laboratories. And as they began to lay out the naming of all the parts, it became clear that that was insufficient. In a way, the model that I'm about to show you is one of the most important in the history of ecology. This is Lindemann's trophic dynamic model, where the parts began to be linked to flows, and the models became more dynamic. It's also fun because the central variable of this critical ecosystem model is ooze. And I've always thought that when my colleagues in the biological sciences talk about the difficulty of operationalizing social science concepts, I remind them of the central place in the Lindemann trophic dynamic model of ooze. And they still study these kinds of environments. Meanwhile, that history was also being played out in the social sciences as anthropologists and sociologists and others began to try to understand, for example, indigenous use of natural resources, the comparison between the large agribusiness and the family farm, or the social order of the slum. And out of that work came first conceptions in the social sciences of ecosystems. This is the famous POET model, population, organization, environment, and technology. And what was the breakthrough there, of course, is the demand that these are all the master variables. They all must simultaneously be considered to actually understand complex systems. And as all of you know, and many of you have contributed to, this POET model has been expanded and advanced and enriched. Some of us continue this struggle to understand parts and flows. This is a model of the structure and dynamics of human ecosystems. It's our result of collaborative work with Bill Birch and others over a long, long period. It's a modest, slow effort to identify and understand 36 key variables about human ecosystems. Now that seems like a lot, but let's put it in perspective. F-150 Ford pickup truck, 1970, has about 5 idiot lights. Oil, gas, that kind of thing. Speedometer. A Cessna has about 50, a magnitude higher. A 747 has about 500, and the Challenger, when it was flying, had about 5,000. We're talking about trying to understand the structure and dynamics of human ecosystems with a Cessna set of variables. Some of them have taught us even understanding the variables gets complex. This looks like a dam holding back water, and it is. But of course, in the American West, it's also holding back economic wealth. It's also holding back political power. It's also holding back the link between wealth, power, and water. And all of those get combined. The mistake would be to consider this to simply be a biophysical dam. The same goes with food. Food is a mix of food chemistry, of nutrition, social meaning, taboo, connective functions of feasts and festivals. All of that stuff matters. And then there's another example of materials. Materials both legal and really dangerous, and illegal and really dangerous. This is probably the first time at an ISSRM meeting that someone has shared with you the recipe for the manufacture of cocaine. It takes about 15 kilos of sulfuric acid, 20 gallons of kerosene, 24 kilos of lime, 3 kilos of sodium carbonate. The filtrate is traditionally toilet paper. That's why the DEA tracks toilet paper deliveries into Colombia and Peru. And it links the water quality of upstream Colombia and Peru to the cocaine use in Washington, D.C., in New York City, in Miami, and in Edmonton, Alberta. We are linked to this system. And then there are those materials that we do not understand. This is Fogo do Amore. Costs about $2 a bottle. It's popular in Africa, and I cannot vouch for its efficacy. Territory is another example of the kind of variable that teaches us more than it might at first. These are the territories of the gangs of L.A. And you can see the bounty hunters, the bishops, the Crips, the Athens Park Gang, the Denver Lanes, Inglewoods, the brims. It does not take an ISSRM sociologist to understand that that's a bad place to be. But that kind of territory and what it means matters. And then there are the timing cycles, the standard cliche in the forest industry, cut it back and grow it back. And then there are the larger timescales that we are only just now beginning to grapple with, like Michael Mann's famous hockey puck of climate change over 1,000 years. The challenge that I suggest to you is to expand the relevancy of the environmental social sciences to both hope and devastation, north and south, modernity and tradition. My focus today is on the needs and opportunities, not on the specific methods, theory, or practice, but on the needs and opportunities. In each of the cases I'm about to present, much is already underway. Many of you are engaged, but there is more to do. First, the ecology of hope. We've made significant contributions. Let me share with you a set of examples about what to be hopeful about. Protected areas would certainly be one. This is Jarvis Park in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta. Small pocket parks. Then there are the larger city parks. This is Central Park in New York, the Sheep Meadow, and in the back, Jackie Kennedy Onassis Reservoir. And then there are the larger parks like Denali in National Park, in the U.S. National Park System. Science has made a significant contribution to protected areas, whether it's George Melendez Wright. I find this picture interesting. That's him in 1929, and then this is a contemporary scientist. The clothing has changed, the equipment has changed, but still we focus on inventory, monitoring, and description. We've had extraordinary successes. The restoration of the bison in Yellowstone. The extraordinary protection and restoration of alpine ecosystems in Mount Rainier under heavy use, driven much by the social sciences and their understanding of visitor behavior. And then there is Papahānaumokuākea, the Marine Reserve. 140,000 square miles. 140,000 square miles. Larger than all the national parks in the United States combined. And the reserves, infrastructure, for 140,000 square miles, you're looking at it. A runway and a house. And yes, there is a manager there. Then there's Masai Mara in Kenya, with all its intensive management and the huge capacity and hopefulness of the safari tradition in Africa, switching from hunting and killing to hunting and shooting photos. A significant transition that might well be emulated elsewhere. And then, of particular interest to me, comes species conservation, wolf packs in Yellowstone. Reef work, this is in the Florida Keys, the restoration of reef. And then the giant panda conservation. I was first introduced to giant panda work in 1979. And yes, a baby panda feels like a dirty golden retriever. And yes, a grown panda can chase successfully a terrified middle-aged male. The original range of the panda was much of China. It is now only in those red areas. But extraordinary amounts of protection have taken place, local engagement, monitoring, and an effort at restoration through artificial raising of panda cub. I'm very proud of this picture, and it's an example among all the faculty here. You know it when you find a student that far exceeds anything you were ever capable of doing. And students, it suggests to you what you can accomplish beyond your faculty. This is one group of cubs born at Wolong Nature Reserve in China. This is the director of all the nature reserves in China. His name is Zhang Heiming, and he was my student. And all I can tell you is I taught him nothing about artificial insemination of panda. But he's been extraordinarily successful, and the panda is a success story. Another hopeful sign is urban sustainability. Whether it's Singapore and its 5 million persons, or solar water heaters. These are solar water heaters in Kunming, Yunnan province in China. And look at the distribution. Each of the buildings carrying so many different heaters. This is interesting. This is 2 of the 17 turbines in a box store, a Sam's store, like a Walmart in California, that generates 76,000 kilowatts, enough for 6 homes and the store. Urban sustainability includes alternative transportations. Believe it or not, this is Mayor Marcelo Eberhard of Mexico City bicycling to work in Mexico City to demonstrate that you can actually do that in Mexico City. Bike shares are popular. This is Washington, D.C. There's now over 1,600 bikes in metropolitan Washington, D.C. that are in a bike sharing program. It just began in 2010, and this year it's had its 2 millionth ride. Its 2 millionth ride. Urban agriculture is another sign of hope. Obviously linked to food quality, security, and sustainability. This is an urban garden in Havana, Cuba. Cuba grew over 1.2 million tons of agricultural product inside its urban areas last year. It's not just Cuba. This is Vancouver. It's hard to read, but these are food-producing gardens in Vancouver. March 2011, there's already 1,000 plots that have been established in Vancouver since 2009. And this is the famous Chicago City Hall, the top of Chicago City Hall. In each of these hopeful areas, we have added to the state of usable knowledge and advanced our understanding and opportunities for hopeful progress. Good for us. But, like Gayin, the poet, and the American cinema remind us, there will be blood. Devastation also is part of our necessary agenda. Here are some examples. War and its aftermath. A group of us have been struggling for a time now, working internationally, to try to understand how one could apply interdisciplinary ecology to issues of warfare. And by warfare, I mean including the preparations for war, from propaganda to stockpiling, war itself, violent conflict, to post-war activities of relocation and restoration. So it isn't just the battle that matters, it's the preparation for war, the war itself, and post-war activities. Here's an example. These are Patton's tanks in 1943 in the Mojave Desert. 40,000 tanks in the Mojave, 1943. And those are the tracks in 1998, still easily visible. This is a picture of U.S. troops at a Nevada field site during a 31 kiloton test to test their combat ability under nuclear attack. So all those men were set there, the bomb went off, and they rushed into the fire zone. This is Vieques, Puerto Rico, or those of us who care deeply about that island, Isla Niña. Vieques has been used and was used since 1941 to 2003 to be bombed by the U.S. and its allies and to practice amphibious attack. In fact, El Yunque National Forest in Puerto Rico was where napalm was developed for the Vietnam War, advanced napalm. Vieques has an extraordinary history. And there's a controversial set of claims of the environmental consequences of this kind of training, including much higher cancer rates among the Viakenses. War itself, of course, has extraordinary environmental consequences. These are the lit fires by Hussein's troops as they retreated from Kuwait during the First Persian Gulf War. And here's a sad story of cultural resources. This is the Starmost, or the Mostar Bridge in Mostar. The bridge is about as wide as maybe these two lanes, not big enough for a car. It has no tactical value. But it linked Serb and Croat, Muslim and Christian. It was a place where couples promenaded, weddings occurred. It was a demonstrable cultural resource for peace, and that is why, after standing for 437 years, it was targeted during the Serb-Croat War in a form of culturecide. It was targeted, and the civilians, both Muslim and Christian, risked their lives. Several died trying to protect this bridge, building things out of grass, hanging old tires, everything they could do until at last they were defeated and the bridge was destroyed in 1993 after 437 years of peace. The role of cultural resources in war and warfare is of significant importance to us. Then there is the Janjaweed in Sudan. And the impact of the Janjaweed War upon the peoples of Sudan, particularly Darfur, is an example of the importance of applying our work to restoration. How do you restore a landscape like that? If you'll notice, those are homes. Those are shelters. We need protection, we need water, we need relocation. All of our geography and spatial work and GIS skill and remote sensing and landscape ecology can be brought to bear to these issues. This is a small photograph. It's not the complete image. It's not the complete image of the Abu Sheikh refugee camp in northern Darfur taking 21 June 2007. That's a part of a refugee camp. What would happen if all the advances in social ecology could be brought to bear on improving refugee camps? For example, all of that outdoor recreation equipment that is advanced and we get to carry it to go to parks and go backpacking, what if you could develop a tent, a refugee tent, that had just enough solar power for 3 little LED lights on the front entranceway of that tent? What would that do? What that would do in Haiti is reduce the rate of rape of women and young girls by men in the camps because of no lighting. So all kinds of opportunities exist in terms of war and warfare for us to better understand and apply our skills. There is more devastation ahead. HIV/AIDS. 25 million people have died from HIV/AIDS since 1981. 25 million. 34 million are infected as of 2010. Another 34 million. And it is heavily concentrated. If you were a 15-year-old in South Africa this year, your life that you face a 50% chance of becoming infected in South Africa. Its impact on people, this is in Mozambique, its impact on communities, on persons, on households is direct and relevant. And the social ecology of AIDS has been recently written, unfortunately not by one of us, but by a doctor and a reporter, not by one of us, but by a doctor and reporter, Craig Timber and Daniel Halperin, in their book Tinderbox, How the West Sparked the AIDS Epidemic. And the social ecology is fascinating. Simian immunodeficiency viruses have moved to humans before. But it's very localized because of the social ecology of these villages and places. And so the virus died out. But this time, and we now know that modern HIV/AIDS came from a transfer of simian immunodeficiency virus in about 1904, and it came from a specific place in Cameroon. Ironically, AIDS came from what is now a national park. And it traveled downriver, and it traveled down railroad lines, because remember, the great powers in 1904 had carved up Africa. They had built railroad lines, they had opened up the economy, they had opened up the exchange routes, and now the disease was loosened upon the world as it traveled to Brazzaville and Kinshasa, and from there to Haiti, and from Haiti to France, and elsewhere. So now the disease is open to us. The sociology of this kind of virus and disease is directly relevant to our skill sets. This is a social network analysis of sexual relations in a single village in Malawi, because polygamy, as practiced, kept closed networks of sexual behavior, replaced by contemporary approaches, which opened it up to immense, complex kinds of linkages. The response is interesting. In Uganda, they had a very successful abstinence program called zero grazing. And they borrowed zero grazing from the agricultural metaphors, where you would stake your goat on a leash, and the goat would graze a zero. And the argument here is the men should be staked and graze where they should within the zero grazing. It disappeared. This abstinence, local, culturally based, natural resource metaphor approach disappeared on the onslaught of Western approaches, which ignored protection, like circumcision, for example, in favor of response to the disease once you're infected, which required high, expensive Western drugs. The impact on communities, the resilience of communities attacked by the AIDS virus, is relevant to our work and worthy of our attention. Some local devastation, Katrina. Late in August 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall. The levees began to break. New Orleans flooded in a major catastrophe and a major failure of American government response. These are the flooded streets of the lower Ninth Ward. 1,800 souls, 1,800 American citizens died in this flood. That's the lower ward in the Katrina 2005. That's not the first time. This is Louisiana 1934, the Ninth Ward, when it was deliberately flooded to protect the agricultural interests downstream. And the people of New Orleans suffered in Katrina, and we learned much about emergency response and the social ecology of disaster. And again, the skill sets of ISSRM members can be brought to bear. Now, from New Orleans to Haiti is not a long distance. The use and abuse of Haiti by the North, and there I mean the French, the Spanish, the Americans, has been well documented by others. And it is a chronic devastation. On the right is the Dominican Republic. On the left is Haiti, and I bet you can figure out where the boundary is. And then came the earthquake of January 2010, a chronic event, and an acute event laid on top of a chronic crisis. The earthquake devastated its infrastructure. Look what we take for granted in natural resource management. In the first 4 seconds of the earthquake, the National Geospatial Agency of Haiti was pancaked. The director and all Haitian citizens who knew professional GIS skills killed. The equipment, database, and backup destroyed. And so at the very point Haiti needs to rebuild, it has no GIS capacity. And American firms volunteered to come in and help. refugee camp. This is a refugee camp near Port-au-Prince Airport. It was fascinating for those of us working in Haiti, particularly those interested in parks and recreation. Golf courses make ideal refugee camps. They're flat, relatively, well-drained soils. They've got good sandy pits for latrines. There's a water supply, and nobody else is living there. You go to Port-au-Prince now, or you go to Pétionville up higher on the hills, every park, every best park, a park this big, filled with refugee camps. Only about 40% of the refugees have been moved out of the original camps. And the tents remain 16th century technology. Cloth or plastic laid across wood. 16th century. The social ecology grad student that invents a refugee tent of the future will have saved innumerable lives. Innumerable lives. And the future there, of course, is to rebuild science in that country. Notice I say rebuild. We make a mistake when we think Haiti did not have science. And to rebuild its science education. More later. More devastation. Deepwater Horizon. The explosion, 20 April 2010, 11 men were killed. We now know, regardless of what the government at one point was saying, 1,400 barrels per day, the actual number was 53,000. So we now know about 53,000 barrels a day were leaking out of the Deepwater Horizon where the blowout preventer crimped. Oil seeping into the salt marsh. We learned a lot about emergency response for those agencies like the National Park Service. Half our battle was to fight the oil's impact on the parks, and the other half to fight the impact of the cleanup upon the parks. Because we were fighting essentially the last war. Do you realize, those of you interested in cartography and GIS, that the incident command centers for the Deepwater Horizon all showed all the oil distributed two-dimensionally, like the Exxon Valdez disaster in Alaska 20 years earlier, and that until toward the end of the battle, there were no three-dimensional maps of the oil spill. And remember, there was a period where they were denying the existence of the plumes. They had no way to visualize it. And even now the struggle exists. Will we fight the next oil spill using Deepwater Horizon techniques? So a group of us that included several ISSRM members formed a strategic sciences group to try to do scenario planning of what would be the cascading consequences on the ecology, the economy, and the people of the Gulf of Mexico. Here's a hint for those of you working on science during crisis that was fun for us to learn. We would draw all this stuff and then attempt to computerize it so we could model and do different things. And this is an off-the-shelf software program. The first time we didn't have much time, I called a grad student and I said, get on the plane after you buy this software, read the manual on the plane, arrive in Mobile ready to run it. That's less effective than you might imagine, though the grad student did a heroic job. So the second time when we went to work, we called the company and said, do you want to help save the Gulf of Mexico? They said, sure, what do you want? Send us the guy who designed the software program to run it for us. That was an improvement. That was really fun. Because this young man over on the far right, he designed the software, and when you say, can you make it do this? He goes, you're not supposed to, but then he would do that. And the results were intriguing. This, for example, is one of the maps of the cascade of consequences. This is simply one of the boxes. And some of it was quick, fast, and extraordinary, and others long. One of the great natural experiments that awaits and social science experiments that awaits us in this country is the arrival of a Category 4 or a Category 5 hurricane right up the track where the oil, which has been sequestered in shallow water, patchy and of different thicknesses, if that hurricane rides right over it with no turbulent roll-up, then the response of the Gulf of Mexico can be steady and improved resilience. But if the turbulence, if the hurricane re-releases the sequestered oil, flinging it back on shore and creating another Deepwater Horizon, another major oil spill, and then another one 4 or 5 years later, you have a system that is in complete, continual lack of resilience, weakening with each spill. And we don't know. And the only people I can find who do know the physics of the turbulence of shallow water hurricane are the submarine research folk in the Navy, and that's classified. And they won't share. What happens next on the next storm, we should be prepared to understand what would be the impact on the people, economy, and ecology of the Gulf of Mexico of the Deepwater Horizon oil re-attacking that system. Because hurricane season started this week. Then there's Fukushima Daiichi. Fukushima Daiichi, characterized as the worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl. It was triggered, of course, by a massive 9.0 magnitude earthquake on the 11th of March. And the resulting tsunami led to several operating plants failing, and 2 of them having significant meltdown consequences. This is a photo of the tsunami actually rolling through the Fukushima Daiichi plant number 1. You can see, for example, a car being smashed up against one of the walls. When it failed, the consequences were enormous for Japan, but enormous elsewhere. It's 7,000 kilometers from Fukushima Daiichi to the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in Richland, Washington. 7,000 kilometers. And this is a chart that shows logarithmically xenon-133, an inert gas, not harmful, but it is a result of fission. It is a result of nuclear fission. And this shows when, right here, Fukushima Daiichi began to leak, and it shows 5 days and a growth that's 40,000 times higher. 40,000 times higher, the xenon 133 monitoring in Richland. Disasters are global, and the interconnectedness of these disasters is of relevance to what we do. And in Japan, the evacuation, the power grid turndowns, brownouts, the economic perturbations, and the huge cultural impacts. Does this picture resonate with any of you? I didn't put another one in. Try to remember. It's pictures of the Nazis with young children in the ghettos of Europe. Look at the child. Now this is peaceful. This is peaceful. But to the Japanese people, this is devastation. So, with that list of potential disasters, what kind of action do we do? Again, the challenge that I place to you is to expand the relevancy of environmental social sciences and human ecology. Peter Piot, the former head of the UN program on HIV/AIDS, has argued that social scientists can make significantly stronger contributions than we have. He calls us all to task. The bibliometric analyses support his claim. We congratulate ourselves on how we apply our social science to natural resources issues, yes, but only 1.6% of the 100,000 social science papers published in the last 5 years, only 1.6% include the key words climate change or environmental change. We also need to be humble about the impact of our work. The scientific shelf life of the social sciences is remarkable. The average citation rate for all the social sciences is less than 1 a year. And that's the average citation rate. Luc van Lagenhort The vice president of the International Social Science Council says, quote, "The main solution, however, is to change the mindset of the social science community and what it considers to be its main goal. If I were a student now," he writes, "I would throw myself at global challenges." When we do that, we're faced with ambivalence again, because some of these issues are not just hope and some are not just devastation. And we need to try to figure out how they are linked together. Look at climate change. In terms of its impact on some species, there are 19 subpopulations of polar bear. 8 are in decline, 3 are stable, 1's increasing, and 7 we don't have enough data to know. And climate change does not just have effect on charismatic megafauna. That's a mosquito. Climate change has impacts on disease-spreading vectors as well, and interestingly, it's ambivalent. It is not all positive or negative. This is from the World Health Organization suggesting that climate change, under certain conditions, has a set of potential positive impacts, but significantly more negative impacts. But in some locations, climate change will lead to a reduction in disease threat. Up to 6 million climate refugees are predicted per year by 2020. What role do we play in trying to understand the impact of climate change refugee patterns and how to ameliorate those? Wind energy, again ambivalent. It has significant potential as an alternative energy source. Its impact, we're only learning now, on birds and bats are significant. In the US, about 500 raptors a year are killed by these, what are called in the conservation community bird Cuisinarts. Then there is Edmonton, Alberta, and the tar sands, just north of here. The tar sands represent a vast and voraciously sought resource. It takes 2 tons of oil sand to create 1 barrel of oil. It involves the stripping of the overburden, which I find an ironic term that the mining industry uses to describe topsoil. They call it overburden, so they can get rid of it because it's very burdensome. And it strips about 100 feet deep. But it's ambivalent. The Keystone Pipeline, even though it goes through the Aglala aquifer, with its potential impact upon one of the major aquifers sustaining Midwest U.S. agriculture, has particular opportunity to alter political arrangements worldwide concerning oil. And the ambivalence and extent of this kind of development in the north is significant. This is dust rising over the Suncor Millennium Mine north of Fort McMurray. So, what's a pathway forward here? I would argue one is understanding Nelson Mandela's clear claim that if you want to solve real-world problems, it is all about the youth, the next generation. And so we need, as a path forward, I believe, to bring a next generation into ISSRM and other institutions dealing with this kind of social science and environmental science, and inculcate in them the hope and devastation of their work. This is the Bridges of Hope Computer Lab in the Matsavuki Primary School in South Africa. And it's not all formal education. This is the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh. And education of youth represents both hope and devastation. This is an amazing picture. This is a picture of a high school graduation in Pétionville, Haiti. 12 of the 53 students survived. Notice they're all dressed up. And they're having the graduation on the steps of their school in a UNICEF tent, for that is all that's left. But still, in spite of all that, look at them. Proud, formal. When I visited this as an observer representing the U.S., it was very emotional and moving. And a young lady got up to play a violin to start the ceremony. And I said, oh, shit, I'm going to lose it. I'm just going to start crying. And I was like, oh, this is too much. And she saved me because she played horribly. It sounded horrible, which just let me feel that this was a very emotional moment instead of collapse in a sobbing heap of whatever. Civic engagement is another part of the path forward. Educating citizenry. And the next step is, of course, educating our politicians. A difficult but not impossible task. This is one of my heroes on the left at that same graduation. His name is Guy Etienne, and he is the science teacher at Collège Pressoir in Pétionville. 2 years before the earthquake, he began to teach his students how to build from scratch a seismograph, then how to maintain it, and then how to calibrate it and monitor it. Then he taught them first response to earthquake and first aid. When the earthquake hit, and the Haitians have a name for it because of the sound it made as the ground moved. They call it, and I can't say it as sinister as they can in Creole. They call it gudu gudu. And when gudu gudu hit, he ran back to his school because he was away at a meeting. And none of his children were harmed. They were out in the community doing first aid and first response. And I said, that's incredible, Guy. That's amazing that you would teach that in the science class. And he looked at me in fascination and pity. And he said, Gary, I taught that in the civics class. And that was like a lightning bolt that went off. Science is civics. The work we do is civics and needs to be included in civic education. Putting science aside as one topic and civic training as another is probably our fault. He is a hero in many ways. So in a way, we have a choice. This is the sixth of the 6 sections. David Suzuki is renowned here in Canada. He's a geneticist by scientific training, an environmentalist by mission, and a graceful author and television documentary maker. He's also a self-proclaimed elder, which I think is really cool. Somewhere we get to just say, I'm an elder. But he's been adopted in 3 First Nations clans. In his wise little book, The Legacy, he reminds us of our real place. He says, science informs us that far, far away from the center of the universe, out in the cosmic boondocks, is an undistinguished galaxy, the Milky Way. And among the billions of stars in that galaxy, our sun is a very ordinary one. And on the 3rd planet, Earth, it's just a mere speck in the heavens. And life arose in just the last quarter of that cosmos' existence. And in the very last moment of that time, something astonishing happened, he writes. A creature emerged from nature endowed with self-awareness, dazzling creativity, and a capacity for love and wonder. But in a moment of explosive change, we lost our way, forgot the narrative that reminded us of who we are, why we are here, and where we belong. In a way, we are like Faust. We have the capacity to create a sense of wonder, a sense of affection for the earth, and we have the power to create a Dante-like hell on earth. I am personally hopeful because we are the species that invented music. Thank you. We'll leave Elvis up.
Thank you. We have an opportunity for questions here for a few minutes, and we're going to have microphones come into the audience. You don't need to stand at a podium, but rather the microphone can come to you. So why don't you just put up your hand if you want to ask Gary a question. At the back here. Yep, in the blue.
Hi, Gary. Thank you very much for that.
Or you could shout.
I'm fairly good at the shouting, but Gary, thank you, and this is why I don't. Gary, thank you very much for that. There was a geographer a couple of years ago who wrote a paper saying that we social scientists are much better at studying war and what produces the conditions of war, but very bad at studying what produces the conditions for peace. What do you have to say to that?
I think he's correct, but they are interrelated. An attempt to study the conditions of peace without understanding the underlying structural conflict, the underlying weaknesses, the role of hatred, lack of resources, lack of distribution, of equity of those resources. If we don't study both together, we are unlikely to be successful. That's why I suggest it is a synthesis of war and peace that we need to study. And anyone who wants to study peace but doesn't want to look at war is making a serious mistake. Other than that, I don't have a view. Someone else? Yes, ma'am. You can just shout.
Liking and not liking flowcharts. How do you feel now in your career about that tool?
That's a good question. The question was, it seems that you have an affinity and affection for flowcharts. How do you feel about it now? As an old man now, because my handwriting is no longer legible, flowcharts are the only way I can communicate systematically. I think that they are useful, for they are one of the few ways we have to find ourselves wrong, to find our mistakes. So if you're writing a narrative, it's very difficult to identify, that's the mistake I'm making. Here's the place I can do better. But with flowcharts, particularly when you communicate them to others, you have the opportunity for the other to say, or yourself to realize something's missing, the cascade of consequences is in error, and advance. So I see them as a tool of denial of your own arrogance. And that's why I find them useful. Someone else? Yes, sir.
Humans were not included as part of that ecosystem.
The Shepard diagram, yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm wondering, often in science, we perhaps still neglect the human in that role, whereas in society, perhaps humans are seen as central and the role of science is perhaps neglected. So what are some of the ways you envision that disconnect closing?
And the question has to do with the role of people in nature and that kind of thing. And again, these views are only my own, right? I'm an Idahoan. And in Idaho, mavericks are horses that go the wrong direction. So that's what this is. I think one of the great dangers we have is the self-examination, the struggle we have within ourselves, fighting over names and rhetoric. I've been in the business that you are in for a very long time, and I can't figure it out and don't give a damn about the difference between environmental sociology, human ecology, cultural ecology, social anthropology, cultural anthropology, human dimensions. None of that matters to me. There's more horses here. What matters is to take the skill set and apply it to the broader world, not the self-naming. To me, I'm not suggesting others should ignore that, but I've never had a fascination with it. The same argument goes, every breath taken, arguing with others, We need to bring people into nature, and nature into people is a breath taken from trying to figure out how do we build better refugee camps? How do we reduce warfare? How do we restore ecosystems? And so I come from that kind of applied thing where those kinds of debates, they operate, they're not so much at 60,000 feet, they're in a fog somewhere else. They're in a fog somewhere else. And my argument to the young graduate students here is that you probably can find better things to do with yourself than get in those arguments. But that's just my opinion. Yes, sir.
Particularly in protected areas, and I think that what you're proposing in terms of the kinds of expansion of social science into many of these other areas is fine and noble stuff, and certainly valuable stuff. But now you've convinced us that we need more social science, and yet you're sending off social scientists to do a whole bunch of other things that don't relate to now this need that you've created in the protected areas community. Do you think that the social science community is large and robust enough to be able to do all of these things that you speak of?
Now the horse really goes in the wrong direction. I will answer truthfully as best I can. All of that, the stuff about hope, parks and protected areas and the use of social science to make improvement, that's vital and important. Yes, it is. But if I was talking to, like I am, the young people in this room, I would say to them candidly as a person, don't make a career of it. Don't make that the only thing you work on. Your science is more powerful than even that. And it can be applied to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And I don't mean the religious one. I mean the secular one of disease, of hunger, of conquest, of war. And they're related. We did a paper in Biological Conservation, or one of those journals, and we simply looked at biodiversity hotspots laid on top of conflicts over the last 50 years. It does not take a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. That the conflicts and biodiversity are independently linked. And the link between geopolitics and protected areas matter. What will be the impact if peace breaks out between North and South Korea on the demilitarized zone, one of the largest refugia in Asia? And they open it for economic development. So my argument would be working in both these areas of hope and devastation makes you stronger to do both well. And whether we're robust or not, whether we have enough grant money, whether we have enough courses, all of those are in the weeds. It's a moral duty. It's a moral duty. In your own way. I'm not saying do it the way we've done it, but I'm suggesting each of us has to figure out, I've got a powerful skill here. What am I going to put it to? Someone else? Yes, sir.
Thank you for the excellent visuals and presentation. What I find fascinating both is the elements of the complexity of the issues that you've addressed and our capacity now in the 21st century to have such, advancing scientific knowledge. But at the same time, I think that sometimes the element of information overload and, steps towards action seems to be the challenge. So where do you see this need for the understanding of complexity, which requires, advanced systems, but at the same time not being overwhelmed by the information, the data that's available to us? That's
a good question. In the general, broader scientific community, the newest fashion in the National Science Foundation, and this is in the U.S., Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, all of that is toward what they call big data and the management of big data. And the social science community, particularly ISSRM, would be well served to begin to focus on what are the implications of big data, large, complex data sets, and how can we contribute to their intelligent use. It gets complicated, like you said. We have remote sensing techniques that could be used to identify for refugee migrations routes that deliver water, food, fodder, in ways that could save lives. Go this path, not this path, if you're escaping a war-torn area. But the problem is that same data can be used by the opponents to isolate, identify, and slaughter them. And so a lot of this depends on our ability to sort through the implications of what we're doing. But I would recommend some of us turn our attention to the management of big data and what that means for social science and the environment. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you very much for that talk. I found it one of the most interesting keynotes and definitely emotional and connecting.
And it ended with Elvis. You know, so.
Yeah, of course. What I'm really interested in is more and more we're understanding the scale of just environmental impacts, and then let alone conflict and war and all that sort of stuff. And it can be quite paralysing, I think, as individuals, as practitioners or researchers, and then we engage with others, whether it be the community or political levels or whatever. I'm really interested in how we, I guess, motivations, how we balance the fear and the scary stuff with the positive and the hopeful stuff in that engagement.
Right. The first, I would argue, is that there is no one right scale. One of the strengths of the work represented by this group is that we operate at different scales. Some of us are working at the community level, some at the household level, some at the bioregional level, and no one scale is so dominant in its effect that the others should be ignored. So work at whatever scale you feel comfortable, and you have the scratch to work. You have the cash and resources to work on. But that scale can be transferred. Maybe you don't work, maybe you work at the household level, but it's the tent at a refugee camp household. What Gaza in occupied Palestine was supposed to be a temporary refugee camp. It's now a 30-year-old city of 250,000 using refugee camp sewer infrastructure. What are the implications of that? What are the implications of belligerent occupations on environment in areas? So I guess pick whatever scale you want, and then my suggestion is work in hope and work in devastation. Both will make you stronger. If all you did is devastation, you'd get really grim and cynical like me. But if you work in hope alone, you are not applying your full set of skills to the powerful questions that confront you. And all of us have the ability to make the choice if we want to do it or not. And I'm just being a cheerleader. Try it.
One last question, probably.
Yes, sir.
Gary, thanks very much for your presentation. I had a question. I think we humans are masters at adaptation. So we can adapt to various things. Some of the visuals you showed us are amazing. We also have a keen ability to adapt in a sense that we can not see what's going on or ignore and turn away from things that need to be addressed. I wonder if you might comment on possible hopeful outcomes at the federal level for addressing some of the needs for coordinating science to answer some of these questions.
And I take it your question is on the U.S. federal level. Not much. I believe that if we wait for the federal government in the United States to coordinate, to organize, to provide the facilitation and the scratch to be able to do it, the resources, to be able to do the science that is needed, we will wait a very long time. And it is in the U.S. history of science only a temporary, small, modern idea that the federal government was going to be the place where you did science and the way that you do it. So I would recommend a much more diverse approach. But I also would suggest there are extraordinary niches for us to create our own needs. Think of this. In our work on warfare ecology, we discovered that the humanitarian organizations, Mercy Corps, Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, Engineers Without Borders, all the humanitarian organizations do not have a pipeline by which contemporary environmental science, including the social sciences, is delivered to them. Now, do we need 6 more journals on climate change? But perhaps the stage is set for a journal that delivers to professional humanitarian relief workers all the amazing work that we're capable of doing to help save lives. So that coordination, by the way, won't come from the federal government, the State Department or FEMA or Strategic Sciences or any of us. It will come from NGOs, foundations. You realize what's starting this morning? Rio Plus 20. And if anybody here thinks the leaders at Rio Plus 20 are the federal government of either the United States or any of the great powers, then you haven't been reading about Rio Plus 20. So I guess I would urge no one organization, no one unit of government is going to get us out of this mess. We have to do it ourselves. You've been all very patient with me. I hope I wasn't too depressing. Thank you.